Hi guys, welcome back to another video on my channel, where today we're going to be talking about manual mode on cameras and ideally why you should be shooting on it, and also what it is. When you take a picture on your phone, it will usually be in completely automatic mode, and basically what that means is that the camera in your smartphone is doing everything for you, and that's very easy. Anyone can pick up a phone camera and do that. Generally tends to be the rule within DSLR and sort of point and shoot cameras as well. Every camera will have an automatic mode built into it. I'll show you the dial. It's usually a little green square here. This is, I don't know if you can see it, it's this little green square here. And basically what that means is that the camera is doing everything for you. When you shoot in manual mode, that's sort of where you really need to be aware of how the camera works and what it's going to be able to do for you if you choose to use it. There's three main things to bear in mind when you shoot in manual mode, and how I tend to refer to that is the exposure triangle. Essentially what that is your shutter speed, your ISO and your aperture. I'll explain those three things in detail as fast as I can, so this video doesn't end up being too long. Essentially your shutter speed is how long you're exposing the camera sensor for. So when you look at the screen of most DSLR cameras, you'll get, say, 1 and then a slash and then a number. Basically what that is, that's 1 over however many somethings of a second. So if you've got a shutter speed of 1/200 for a second, it'll be 1/200, and basically what that means is from when you press the shutter button, the sensor's going to be exposed for 1/200 of a second. I'll just show you very quickly here. Sometimes you can actually hear it. Alright, let's go on manual mode. Right now, this is 1/8 of a second. So from when I press the shutter button, the camera sensor is going to be exposed for 1/8 of a second, and for whatever happens within that 1/8 of a second is going to be captured and put into a final image. So you can just listen to this. So you can see that's quite slow. Let's just go even slower just for the sake of explaining it. This is 1/6 of a second. Yeah, so there you go. You can see how slow that is. And then if we want to make it really fast, we use something like 1/2000th of a second. Essentially what that means is just literally the same thing as I just explained before. Whatever happens in that 1/2000th of a second is going to be captured and put onto the image sensor. It comes out in the final image, and that sounds like this. So you can see that's really fast in comparison to something like 1/6 of a second or 1/8, which is this. Okay, so what you'll want to use fast shutter speeds for is things like sports photography, maybe taking pictures of things moving quite fast, because it means you can, in general, means you can freeze the subject and have it really sort of pristine and clear. Slower shutter speeds you want to use for long exposure photography, which is where you see a lot of photographers using light trails to create art. That's something that I've done in the past, and it's actually quite cool. As a general rule of thumb, you'll tend to do that at night, unless you want to use ND filters for daytime. Your camera can adjust to the brightness of day. How I like to refer to them is basically they're sunglasses but for cameras, if that makes any sense at all. And next we have aperture. Within every single lens you've got something called aperture, and that's measured by something called f-stops. Basically means how wide open the lens opens up to let in light. And most lenses that come with cameras have apertures of f3.5 to 5.6. This is a standard aperture range. It won't give you that good low light capabilities because 3.5 really isn't that bright and doesn't let in that much light in comparison to most prime lenses, which have apertures of, for example, f2, f1.8 and f1.2. There are a couple lenses out there which go down to crazy apertures like f0.95, but they tend to be manual lenses, and if they're not manual they're really expensive. So f1.8 is probably the most affordable aperture to go for. These tend to be found in prime lenses. Prime lenses are lenses that don't zoom. They are fixed focal lengths, but then again you get the trade-off of having that wide aperture, which is really good for low light, also really good for blurring out your backgrounds as well, which looks really nice. And then the third factor to take note of when you're shooting in manual mode, what that is, this is the final step to achieving a good exposure. So your aperture and your shutter speed should always come before your ISO, because ISO is essentially how sensitive you're making your camera sensor to light. So the more you go up in ISO, the more noisy and grainy your image will get, and you'll start to lose image quality, which is why you'll really want to put an emphasis on the shutter speed and the aperture of your image before you go to ISO. Right now I'm shooting at ISO 400, and you can notice it's quite clean. On most cameras these days you can probably get away with shooting at 1600 or maybe 3200, but obviously as camera sensors get better, then the higher ISOs will be better at dealing with noise and things like that. But as a general rule of thumb, you will want to keep your ISO down if you want to get a good exposure. And then also, there's also a fourth one. I forgot to note that actually. Sorry, there's also a fourth factor as well, which isn't that important because you can just set it to auto, but it is important to note as well. That would be your white balance. Now, white balance is something that changes from situation to situation. It's essentially how sort of blue or orange and warm your image looks. So in bright daylight, you're gonna obviously want to use the daylight setting, and that's basically going to mean that the colors that are reproduced from your sensor are going to be most true to life when you look at them in post. Sorry, when I say post, I mean post-production, as in you put them up on the computer and it's post taking it, if that makes sense. So yeah, it basically just means this changes from situation to situation, as I said before. So if you're inside and you're using orange tinted lights, like for example the light behind me, you're going to want to use a tungsten white balance setting, which is obviously just going to do the exact same thing as I said about the daylight one. It changes from setting to setting, but usually you can just get away with sticking out on auto. Also, something that I realized I probably should have talked about when I was explaining aperture is the fact that different apertures have different uses. So for example, if you're doing landscape photography, you'll want to use a very narrow aperture of something like f9, maybe f11, all the way up to f22. Basically what this means is the narrower, the larger f-stop value you've got, the more things you're bringing into focus, so the bigger depth of field you're going to get. And this basically means that, say if you're using f11, pretty much everything you're going to be shooting is going to be in focus, and then if you go right to the other end of the scale, you're going to have something like f1.4, f1.8, which basically means that you're going to have a really shallow depth of field, which pretty much basically isolates anything you're going to be shooting. This is really useful for portrait photography, because obviously you're going to want to draw the viewer's attention to the subject. Also means that it's going to be better in low light because it's letting in more light into the sensor, which is why lenses with wide apertures tend to be very expensive and the sort of very high end of the scale. One of the trade-offs of using a very narrow aperture is the fact that it won't be very good in low light, and most times you might end up having to use higher ISOs or slower shutter speeds to combat that. One of the downsides of that is that the fact if you're using a slower shutter speed, you're going to want to either have in-body stabilization or put it down on a tripod or a monopod to make it stabilized, because the slower shutter speed you'll use, if you're hand holding it, the chances are that you're going to lose a lot of image quality, because you're going to get a little bit of image blur, which obviously decreases the quality and the clarity of the image, which sucks a bit. I think that's it though. I could go into metering and things like that, but I think that's a bit more complicated and I'll leave that maybe for another video. But apart from that, I think that's been it. If you think I've missed anything, please let me know so I can amend that and make another video on it. But as far as I know, that has been a short introduction into manual mode on cameras, what you need to take into account when using it, and how to use it. So yeah, if this video has been useful to you, please let me know, and like, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one.